Have you ever watched someone plan their revenge so obsessively, so meticulously, that they failed to realize they're setting themselves up for disaster? It's almost poetic, really, to see arrogance so thick that it blinds a person to the simplest truth. Sometimes, life has a way of quietly, elegantly turning the tables. It was a morning in the 1980s, inside a small neighborhood bank. The air smelled faintly of ink, paper, and polished marble. Fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make you squint. Typewriters clicked incessantly, like restless insects, as tellers moved carefully among piles of coins, forms, and slips. Everything was manual. No computers, no ATMs, no instant balances. One small misstep, one miscalculated figure, one misplaced stamp could ruin an entire day. The tension was constant, silent, and almost invisible, but everyone felt it. From the moment he walked in, you could feel the arrogance radiating off him. Sunglasses indoors, shirt slightly unbuttoned, posture rigid yet exaggerated, holding his checkbook like it was a royal decree. And his opening words? Not a polite greeting, no, far from it. "Is anyone here competent?" His tone, dripping with disdain, announced that chaos had arrived. Months of subtle irritation, headaches, and quiet battles of patience were about to unfold. For weeks he complained about everything. Lines were too long, pens didn't write smoothly, the air conditioning too cold, the stamps too loud. Even the retired Army security guard, fearless in all else, sighed deeply whenever this man appeared. And yet, professionalism prevailed. Patience, polite smiles, quiet acknowledgement, these were our shields. People like him mistook patience for weakness, politeness for fear. They never realized patience is a weapon too. Then came that morning. The door banged open, louder than usual, every step exaggerated, every movement calculated to irritate, to intimidate. And then he placed something on the counter, something absurd, almost comically dramatic. A stack. Not a pile, not a bundle, but a brick-sized tower of hundreds of handwritten checks, each for 1 cent. Hours, maybe nights, meticulously written, each line dripping with pettiness and imagined cleverness. He leaned in, smirked, and whispered with mock triumph, "Bet you didn't expect someone to outsmart your system, did you?" The teller beside me froze, calculating silently. 3, maybe 4 hours of uninterrupted stamping, logging, verifying, a grinding, tedious nightmare. He rocked back and forth, every little movement exaggerated with delight, relishing imagined suffering. But the universe had a quiet, precise, poetic lesson prepared. The teller excused herself, walked quickly to the back office. Customers subtly leaned in, sensing something monumental was about to unfold. And then she appeared, the operations manager. Calm, collected, almost ethereal in her confidence. She approached the counter, assessing the stack, the man, the room, with measured ease. No shouting, no panic, just authority that turned tension into silence. "Sir," she began gently, tone smooth, yet commanding, "you want to close your account?" "Yes," he said proudly, smirk still in place. "And I want every single check cashed individually. That's how I want my money." Her calm never wavered. "Of course. We'll take care of that for you." He expected chaos, yelling, panic, but she carried the stack to her desk, meticulously counted, calculated, and prepared one single debit slip representing the entire total. One slip, one total, one perfectly executed cashier's check. She returned, handed it to him with a polite smile. "Your account is now closed. Thank you for your business." Shock replaced his smug satisfaction. Words failed him. He stormed out, red-faced, muttering. The stack of penny checks? Shredded silently, without ceremony. The tellers exhaled, tension released in quiet chuckles, and the lesson lingered. Patience, calm, and skill often triumph over arrogance, cleverness, and pettiness in the most elegant way imaginable. The tension in the bank was almost tangible that morning. Every customer, every teller, every stack of paper seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something monumental to unfold. I could feel the nervous energy prickling along my arms like static electricity. There was an almost electric stillness, a quiet anticipation, because everyone sensed the absurdity of what had just occurred, yet none of us fully grasped the extent of it. He stood there, eyes wide, fists tightening unconsciously, utterly convinced of his brilliance. The look on his face was a mixture of smug pride and disbelief. Disbelief that the chaos he had so meticulously orchestrated could be so effortlessly undone. Every night he had spent writing those 1-cent checks, every hour he imagined us spending stamping, logging, verifying, it was all meant to be a personal triumph. And now, all of it was gone, collapsed in a single elegant move. I remember watching him shift his weight nervously, glancing around for validation, some sign that the bank had indeed been outsmarted. But there was none. The operations manager's calm, measured movements left no room for argument, no room for protest, only the quiet reality that his plan had failed spectacularly. And yet, in his mind, he still tried to justify it. Surely, he must have thought, there's a loophole, some trick I've overlooked. Meanwhile, the tellers exchanged subtle glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others barely holding back quiet laughter. There was a collective relief, a shared understanding that sometimes human arrogance is the most entertaining spectacle of all. And the irony was not lost on any of us. Here was a man who had spent countless hours trying to inflict frustration on others, and instead, he had inflicted it on himself. Time seemed to slow. Every small gesture he made, tapping fingers impatiently, fidgeting with his glasses, shifting weight from one foot to the other, was exaggerated in the silence of the room. And I thought to myself, this is the exact moment when patience and expertise shine brightest. The quiet competence of someone who knows the system inside out, who does not need to yell or argue, simply lets the rules, the processes, and the logic do the work. And then came the murmurs from the other customers. Some whispered to each other, trying to stifle laughter, trying to process the absurdity of a grown man bested so completely by procedure and professionalism. Others simply shook their heads, faces mixed with amusement and incredulity. The story of the penny checks, his master plan, was quickly becoming legend among the regulars. I couldn't help but reflect on the nature of arrogance, how easily it blinds people, how completely it can distort perception, how someone can believe they are clever only to be undone by the simplest truths. A calm mind, a methodical approach, and a little knowledge of the rules, these were the tools that dismantled his elaborate scheme. And as I watched him finally storm out, flustered and muttering, I realized something profound. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not taken by us, but delivered by life itself. The operations manager returned to her desk, placing a fresh stack of forms aside, each movement deliberate, calm, precise. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, a tiny smile playing on her lips. The tellers returned to their work, coins counting, forms stamping, typewriters clicking, but the air had changed. There was a sense of triumph, subtle and silent, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet unmistakable to anyone who had witnessed the spectacle. And there he was, outside the bank, muttering to himself, probably replaying the events in his head, trying to convince himself that he had been clever, that somehow he had won. But the truth was obvious. The plan that took him countless hours to imagine, countless nights to prepare, had crumbled in seconds. And in that collapse, we all saw a lesson in humility, patience, and the quiet power of competence. After that morning, the memory of the penny checks lingered in the air, like a ghost haunting the routine of the bank. Even days later, every time someone walked through the door, there was a subtle tension, a quiet anticipation, because the story had already begun to grow in legend. Whispers among the staff, small chuckles exchanged in the corners. It became clear, some events are too perfect, too ironic, to ever be forgotten. I often thought about the man himself. How much time had he spent, carefully, meticulously, plotting his small act of revenge? The hours at his dining table, hunched over a lamp, writing line after line, pay to the order of 0.01, each penny a monument to his belief in his own cleverness. And yet, all that effort, all that painstaking calculation, undone with a single stroke of calm authority. The operations manager, quiet as always, returned to her desk and continued her work. Every movement deliberate, precise, almost elegant. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to argue. The rules, the procedures, and her experience were enough. Watching her operate was like watching a masterful performance, subtle, effortless, and devastatingly effective. And in that, the irony was complete. The man's plan required hours, stress, and careful effort. Hers took seconds. Meanwhile, the tellers returned to their own duties, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a subtle sense of relief, a quiet pride in professionalism, patience, and knowledge. And yet a twinge of amusement lingered, because some things are just too absurd not to laugh at. We all knew that no amount of cleverness, no amount of meticulous plotting could outshine calm competence and adherence to the rules. I watched as the man outside fumed, gesturing at passers-by, muttering loudly about how he had been tricked by the bank. People shook their heads, some laughed quietly, others simply walked away, bemused. And the lesson was clear. Sometimes the most spectacular revenge, the most poetic irony, is delivered not by you, but by your own actions. Every time I think back to those mornings, the smell of ink, the flicker of fluorescent lights, the click of typewriters, I can almost see him there, imagining the triumph he never achieved. And I realize how fragile arrogance is, how easily it blinds, how quickly it can be dismantled by something simple, by someone calm, competent, and patient. Even months later, customers would still ask about the penny check man. They laughed, shook their heads, and marveled at the absurdity of it all. And sometimes, when I recounted the story, I would pause, letting the details sink in, letting them imagine the painstaking, futile effort he had invested in a plan that collapsed almost immediately. Because that pause, that reflection, is part of the lesson itself. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible way,
The bank returned to its usual rhythm. The coins counted, forms stamped, typewriters clicking, but the story remained. A perfect reminder that patience, expertise, and calm authority can often outmatch arrogance, pettiness, and overconfidence, and that sometimes the universe delivers justice with its own ironic sense of humor.
Weeks passed, and the story of the penny check man continued to echo quietly through the bank. Every morning, as the doors opened and the first customers walked in, there was a subtle anticipation, a shared understanding among the staff that they had witnessed something unusual, something perfectly ironic. It wasn't just a story about a man and his checks, it was a lesson about patience, competence, and the quiet power of rules. I would sometimes catch myself thinking about him, the hours he must have spent, the nights hunched over dim lamps, writing each line of those painstakingly prepared 1-cent checks, every stroke of his pen dripping with imagined cleverness, every line a monument to his belief that he could outsmart the system. And yet, that carefully constructed plan collapsed in a single, effortless move. One debit slip, one cashier's check, one calm smile from someone who understood the rules far better than he ever could. The operations manager continued to be a quiet force within the bank. She moved with precision, with calm authority, and never wasted a single motion. Every action deliberate, every decision measured, and every moment a silent reminder to anyone watching that skill, patience, and knowledge often triumph over arrogance. And in those moments, the absurdity of the penny check man's plan became even more apparent. Hours of effort, meticulous plotting, all rendered completely meaningless. Meanwhile, the tellers found themselves quietly amused whenever the story was retold. Small chuckles escaped in corners, knowing smiles exchanged. It became more than just a tale of banking. It became almost a legend, a reminder of the consequences of arrogance and overconfidence. Watching him fume outside, gesturing wildly, muttering about how he had been tricked by the bank, it was a kind of poetic justice. Sometimes, I wondered if he ever realized the lesson he had learned, that cleverness without understanding is nothing, that pettiness without perspective is self-defeating, and that a calm, methodical approach can undo even the most meticulously planned schemes. And in the background, the bank continued its quiet rhythm. Typewriters clicking, coins counting, forms stamping, ordinary work, but now colored by the memory of what had happened. Even now, years later, I can recall the scene vividly, the air smelling faintly of paper and ink, the flickering fluorescent lights, the subtle hum of typewriters, and the image of a man undone not by confrontation, but by the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The beauty of that moment, the poetic precision, it was unforgettable. And so the story settled into the quiet lore of the bank, a tale retold in whispers, remembered in smiles, and carried in the minds of those who witnessed it. A reminder that arrogance often carries the seeds of its own undoing, and that sometimes the simplest actions deliver the most elegant justice. Even after weeks, the image of the penny check man lingered in my mind. There was something almost surreal about the way arrogance can build itself into such a tangible presence, and then how quickly it can crumble. He had believed that hours, perhaps even days, spent carefully writing each 1-cent check could somehow frustrate us, disrupt the bank, or prove his cleverness. And yet, in the end, all of that effort amounted to nothing more than a quiet lesson in humility. I could still see him pacing, muttering to himself outside the bank, his face red, his movements frantic. Every passerby he encountered seemed to witness a fragment of his defeat, a man undone not by force,
not by confrontation, but by the simplest application of knowledge and calm authority. Inside the bank, we carried on as always, yet every coin counted, every form stamped, every typewriter click was now tinged with a quiet satisfaction, the subtle triumph of competence over arrogance. The operations manager's calm efficiency had been the true hero of the day. Watching her move through the tasks with precision and patience was almost hypnotic. She didn't rush, she didn't panic, and she didn't even need to raise her voice. Her presence alone, her understanding of the system and the rules, had undone what the penny check man thought was a master plan. It was a lesson in elegance, in how true power often lies in quiet skill, not in shouting or scheming. Inside the bank, we found ourselves occasionally glancing at each other, small smiles exchanged, in silent recognition of the absurdity that had occurred. Even months later, whenever a similar situation arose or a difficult customer appeared, the memory of that day seemed to provide a sense of perspective, a reminder that arrogance, no matter how elaborate, is often its own undoing. And yet, for all the humor and irony, there was a deeper truth embedded in that experience. The hours he spent plotting, the meticulous attention to detail, it had all been an exercise in self-deception. He believed he was clever, that he could manipulate the world to his will. But the real lesson, the subtle, undeniable truth, was that patience, knowledge, and quiet confidence often triumph where cunning alone fails. When I think back now, I can almost hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant clicking of typewriters, the faint smell of ink and paper in the air. And there he is again in my mind, pacing, muttering, red-faced, imagining himself victorious, while the reality, the true outcome, is that his own plan had delivered his defeat. Every detail of his arrogance, every line of his painstakingly written checks had worked not against us, but against him. The irony is what makes it unforgettable. The humor, the lesson, the quiet, poetic justice, all wrapped into one small, seemingly insignificant stack of penny checks. And in that, I realized that sometimes the most satisfying stories, the most memorable lessons, aren't about clever tricks or elaborate schemes, but about how life, patience, and quiet skill can quietly, efficiently, and elegantly restore balance. Time moved on, but the memory of that morning never faded. Every so often, when the bank doors opened, I could feel a trace of that day lingering in the air, a subtle reminder that patience, skill, and calm authority often triumph over arrogance, pettiness, and overconfidence. The story of the penny check man had become almost a legend among staff and customers alike, whispered quietly with laughter and disbelief. I often imagined him in the days that followed, replaying the events in his mind, trying desperately to convince himself that he had been clever, that somehow the bank had tricked him. But the truth was undeniable. The hours he spent meticulously writing 1-cent checks, the nights hunched over dim lamps, the imagined triumph of his plan, all of it had been undone in seconds by a single, calm, and precise action. One debit slip, one cashier's check, and the lesson was delivered. Inside the bank, life continued as always. Coins counted, forms stamped, typewriters clicking. Yet the air felt different, lighter, almost celebratory. Small smiles and quiet laughter echoed in corners as we shared stories of that absurdly meticulous plan. The penny check man had unwittingly given us a story we would remember for years. A story of irony, patience, and the quiet triumph of competence over arrogance. And in reflection, the lesson became even clearer. Arrogance, no matter how carefully planned, can blind a person completely. Cleverness without understanding, pettiness without perspective, these are fragile things. They crumble under the weight of patience, knowledge, and calm action. And sometimes the universe delivers justice in the most elegant and poetic way possible, without shouting, without confrontation, but simply through natural consequence. Even now, decades later, I can picture the scene vividly. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of ink and paper, the rhythmic clicking of typewriters, and the image of a man undone, not by force or argument, but by the quiet, deliberate skill of someone who knew the system inside out. Every line of those painstakingly written checks, every imagined moment of triumph, had served only to highlight his own undoing. The final irony, the sweetest part of it all, is that his revenge ended up teaching the most valuable lesson of all, that patience, expertise, and calm determination often outmatch arrogance, cleverness, and pettiness. And in that quiet, subtle way, the bank had not only survived his scheme, it had reminded everyone present of the timeless power of skill over ego. So, whenever I think back to those days, the stack of penny checks, the calm authority of the operations manager, and the red-faced frustration of the man who tried so hard to outsmart the system, I can't help but smile. Because sometimes, the most satisfying, elegant, and poetic forms of revenge are not taken by you. They are delivered by life itself. And now I ask you, if you had been standing behind that counter, watching him place his painstakingly written penny checks before you, what would you have done? Would you have stayed calm, or would you have let the absurdity consume your patience?